The day Rose Hawthorne handed her last canteen to a dying stranger was the same day she decided she no longer cared whether she lived or died herself, and that particular recklessness turned out to be the beginning of everything. The Mojave Desert in the summer of 1874 was no place for a woman alone, and every soul from Barstow to the Arizona border would have told her so if she had bothered to ask. She had not bothered to ask. Rose was 28 years old, sun-darkened and straight-backed, with dark red hair that burned copper in the afternoon light and green eyes that had cried themselves dry somewhere around the third week after her husband Thomas's funeral. She had buried Thomas Hawthorne on their land outside of Calico, California, in the hard, pale dirt beside the creek that barely ran anymore, and she had stood over his grave with her hat in her hands and thought, now what? Thomas had been a good man, not a perfect man, but good in the ways that mattered, steady, honest, willing to work until his hands bled for the 160 acres they had claimed under the Homestead Act 2 years prior. He had died not from a gunshot or a rattlesnake or any of the dramatic ways the desert chose to kill people. He had died from a fever that came in the night and took him in 4 days, and the doctor had ridden out from Calico too late and said there was nothing to be done and ridden back again, and Rose had been left standing in a house that smelled like camphor and loss. The land was hers now. Everything Thomas had built, she owned. The problem was that everything Thomas had built was not yet enough. The homestead required 5 years of continuous improvements and occupation to gain the final patent from the government, and they were only 2 years in. If Rose abandoned the land, she lost it. If she stayed, she had to run it alone through the hottest months of the year with a well that was going brackish, and a mule named Cornelia who had an opinion about everything. She had decided to stay. She had also decided, in a moment that she later recognized as grief making her stupid, to ride out to the old Morrison claim site 12 miles east to look for the iron pipe fitting that Thomas had been meaning to collect before he got sick. The pipe fitting would help her patch the well casing. It was a logical errand. What was not logical was choosing to make the ride in early June, in the middle of the afternoon, carrying only one canteen because she had not thought carefully about the distance. She found the Morrison site. She found the pipe fitting. She lashed it to Cornelia's saddle and turned back toward home, and that was when the heat truly settled into her like a fist. She was 3 miles from the Morrison site and 9 miles from home when she saw him. He was lying face down in the scrub beside the trail, or what passed for a trail out here, which was really just 2 wheel ruts that the freight wagons had worn into the caliche over the years. He was a tall man, she could see that even from a distance, dressed in a dark canvas coat that made no sense in this heat and wearing boots that had seen hard use. His horse was nowhere visible. His hat had rolled a foot or so away from him and lay brim up as though waiting to collect rainwater that was never going to come. Rose pulled Cornelia to a stop and looked at him for a long moment. She was not a foolish woman. She knew there were men in this desert who would fake injury to lure a traveler close, rob them. Worse, she had heard the stories. She had heard Thomas tell them around the fire on slow evenings when the coyotes were singing in the dark. But the man's face when she swung down from the saddle and walked closer was the color of old brick, and his lips were cracked and bleeding, and when she crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to his throat the way her mother had taught her, his pulse was there but faint and his skin was hot enough to cook on. This was not a man faking anything. This was a man dying. "Hey," she said, not gently. She shook his shoulder. "Hey, you, wake up." He did not wake up. His eyelids fluttered and he made a sound like he was trying to speak, but it came out as nothing but cracked breath. Rose looked at her canteen. It was perhaps a third full. She had been sipping carefully, knowing she had 9 miles to cover in the afternoon sun, knowing that Cornelia also needed water and a thirsty mule was an uncooperative mule. She ran the arithmetic in her head. She knew the arithmetic. She had enough water to get herself home, barely, if she was careful. She looked at the man again. She thought about Thomas, and how Thomas had not had anyone to give him water when the fever took the last of his strength, and how he had died in their bed reaching for a cup that was already empty. She uncapped the canteen and lifted the man's head and tilted water past his cracked lips. He swallowed. Then he swallowed again more urgently, and his hand came up and found the canteen, and she let him drink almost all of it, keeping back only a small mouthful for herself. His eyes opened while he was drinking. They were gray. She noticed an unusual gray, pale as November sky, and they fixed on her with an intensity that she felt even through the haze of sunstroke. He got himself upright after a minute with her steadying his shoulder, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and said, in a voice that sounded like a wagon wheel over dry gravel, "You just gave me your water." "I noticed that," Rose said. "You didn't have to do that." "I also noticed that." He looked at the canteen, which she had recapped and was hanging on her saddle horn. He looked at the empty desert stretching in every direction. He seemed to be doing the same arithmetic she had done and arriving at the same answer. "That was everything you had," he said, "close enough to everything." He was quiet for a moment. He had a good face under the sunburn and the dust, not pretty, but strong, with a jaw that looked like it had been set against hardship so long it had simply stayed that way, and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone that was old and well-healed and spoke of some past trouble that was none of her business. "Phineas Talbot," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. "Rose Hawthorne. Mrs. Hawthorne." She looked at him steadily. "Widow Hawthorne, my husband died 6 weeks ago." Something moved across his face, grief, recognition, she was not sure. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it the way people said it when they meant it rather than when they were just filling silence. "Where's your horse?" she asked. He looked out to the east, shading his eyes. "I lost him 2 days ago." "Through a shoe I was leading him," he spooked at a sidewinder and pulled the lead rope out of my hand. "By the time I could see straight from the sun, he was gone." He paused. "I've been walking. For 2 days." "More or less." Rose considered this. She looked at Cornelia, who was stamping her displeasure at standing in the sun. She looked at the man, Phineas Talbot, who was clearly still unsteady, one hand braced against his knee, though he was trying to hide it. "You can ride the mule," she said. "She'll complain about it, but she'll carry you." "And you?" "I'll walk the last few miles. I've walked worse." He started to protest, and she cut him off with a look that Thomas had once compared to a shut door, and he stopped protesting. She got him onto Cornelia with considerably more difficulty than the situation required, partly because Cornelia had opinions, and partly because Phineas Talbot was longer in the leg than the mule was built to accommodate. But they managed it, and Rose took the lead rope and started walking, and the three of them moved west into the sun, which was thankfully beginning its descent toward the Calico Mountains. He asked her, as they walked, what she was doing out here alone. She told him about the pipe fitting and the well and the homestead claim. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. Most men interrupted. She asked him eventually what he had been doing out there alone without enough water. There was a pause before he answered that told her the pause was meaningful. "I was tracking someone," he said. "Or trying to. I'm a marshal out of Prescott. Had a lead on a man named Cord Dillard who's been running stolen horses through the territory. Lost the trail somewhere east of Barstow and ended up out farther than I'd planned without realizing my horse had drunk the last of the good water 2 days ago." "A marshal," Rose said. "Deputy Marshal, technically. Are you going to try to convince me that makes you more trustworthy or less dangerous?" He made a sound that might have been a laugh if his throat had been in better condition. "Neither, I suppose. Just a man who made poor decisions and is alive because you made a generous one." She looked at him sideways from under the brim of her hat. There was something genuine about him that she could not quite dismiss, something in the level way he spoke that suggested a man who was accustomed to stating things plainly and expected others to do the same. They reached the homestead as the sun touched the mountains, painting everything orange and violent. She drew water from the well for Cornelia and for Phineas Talbot, and she heated beans and cornbread on the stove, and he sat at Thomas's chair at the table with the awareness of a man who knows he is in someone else's place and is trying to take up as little of it as possible. He slept in the barn that night, insisting on it despite the heat, saying he would not take a widow woman's house from her. She gave him a blanket and a lantern and did not argue. In the morning he looked better, still sunburned and rough at the edges, but the grayness was gone from his face and his eyes were clear. He had mended the hinge on the barn door that had been squealing for weeks, she noticed, without being asked. He had also watered Cornelia and fed her. She made coffee and did not comment on the hinge or the mule, and he sat across from her and drank the coffee and looked out the window at the land with an expression she could not entirely read. "I need to get back to Barstow," he said. "Wire Prescott, get a new horse, pick up the trail if I can." He set down the coffee cup. "Is there a stage route I can reach from here? 12 miles north. Stage goes through every Tuesday and Friday." It was Sunday. He nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee cup, then he looked at her. "I'd like to help you with that well before I go," he said. "If you'll let me." She wanted to say no. She had the independent woman's particular discomfort with accepting help, the kind that came from years of watching self-reliance be the only currency that kept you solvent in this country. But the pipe fitting was sitting in her barn, and she had never installed well casing by herself, and the well was getting worse every week. "I'll let you," she said. They spent that day and half of Monday on the well. He knew what he was doing, more than she had expected, and she said so. And he said he had worked a cattle ranch in New Mexico from the time he was 16 until he was 23 before he took the marshal's appointment. So he knew about wells and fence lines and all the 1,000 unglamorous things that kept a piece of land alive. He was 32 now, he said, when she asked. She did not know why she asked except that she was curious about him, in a way she had not been curious about anyone in a long time, and she filed the information away without examining what she intended to do with it. The well casing went in cleanly once they figured out the angle of the slope on the pipe collar. They pumped clean water up in the late afternoon and she drank it straight from the pump and it tasted like relief. He smiled when she did that. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, softened the set jaw and the marshal's careful watchfulness, and made him look like a different kind of man, younger somehow, lighter. "Good water," he said. "Best thing I've tasted in weeks," she agreed. She cooked a better supper that night, salt pork and dried apple with the last of the flour she'd made into proper biscuits, and they ate at the table together with the easy quiet of people who had spent 2 days working alongside each other, and no longer needed to fill silence with performance. He told her about Prescott, about the territory, about the particular lawlessness of the horse theft trade that made men like Cord Dillard both lucrative and difficult to catch. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up the daughter of a school teacher, and about meeting Thomas at a land office in Kansas City 2 years ago, and about the particular kind of hope that had brought them west. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Coming west?" She thought about it honestly. "I regret that Thomas isn't here to see the well working," she said. "But no, I don't regret the land. I don't regret building something." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had a way of seeing more than was comfortable. "You're going to keep the homestead," he said. It was not a question. "I'm going to keep the homestead," she confirmed. He nodded like that settled something. In the morning he shook her hand on the porch before he walked north toward the stage route. His hand was warm and calloused, and he held hers for a moment longer than a handshake strictly required, and he said, "I owe you a debt, Mrs. Hawthorne, a real one. You saved my life. You fixed my well," she said. "Call it even." "I can't call it even," he said quietly. "Water in the desert to a dying man is not the same as a pipe fitting." He held her gaze. "I'll remember." She watched him walk away into the morning light, his silhouette growing smaller against the pale caliche and the scrub, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, a reluctance to see him go that had nothing to do with the well or the help or any practical concern at all, and that she was nowhere near ready to examine. She went back inside and washed the breakfast dishes and told herself that was that. She was wrong, but she would not know it for 3 months. The summer was brutal. Rose had known intellectually that a Mojave summer was brutal, but knowing it and living it alone were different things. The temperature in July climbed past 110 degrees on most days, and she spent those days doing as little as possible in the hottest hours, rising before dawn to feed and water Cornelia, and tend her small kitchen garden, retreating to the house from 11 to 3, going out again in the evening to check the fence lines and the well. The well held beautifully. Every time she pumped the handle and clean water came up, she thought of Phineas Talbot, and then she told herself to stop thinking about Phineas Talbot, and she mostly succeeded. She had neighbors 8 miles west, a couple named Amos and Cora Birch who had been on their claim for 3 years and were the nearest thing to friends she had out here. Amos was 60 and half-deaf and enormously kind. Cora was 55 and had opinions about everything and was also enormously kind, which was a combination that Rose found profoundly reassuring. They rode out twice in July to check on her and bring supplies from Calico, and she was grateful each time in a way that went beyond the practical. "You're too alone out here," Cora said, sitting at Rose's kitchen table in late July with coffee between her hands. "It's not right for a woman alone." "I'm not alone," Rose said. "I have Cornelia." Cora gave her the look that sentiment deserved. "That mule hates everyone equally," she said. "That's not company." Rose smiled. "I manage. Managing is not living, Rose." She thought about that later, when Cora and Amos had ridden home, and the evening silence settled over the homestead like something physical. She sat on the porch with the last of the daylight fading and the first stars appearing over the mountains, and she thought about Thomas, and about the life they had been building, and about what it meant to keep building that life when half of the team was gone. She thought, without entirely meaning to, about gray eyes and a quiet voice that said things plainly. In August she had trouble with a man named Burl Schofield. Schofield ran a cattle operation 20 miles north, a medium-sized affair that had been in the region longer than the homestead claims, and resented the newcomers with the specific intensity of a man who had once had open range and now found it cut up by wire and claim stakes. He had sent men by twice before to offer to buy her land, and twice she had declined politely, and on a Thursday morning in August he came himself. He was a wide man, florid-faced, riding a horse that was too fine for him in the way that some men's horses always were. He came with another man who stayed back on his horse and watched while Schofield dismounted and walked to her porch like he owned it. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I've been patient." "I haven't been difficult," Rose said. She had the Springfield rifle propped against the door frame behind her, visible, which she had put there deliberately when she saw the dust from 2 riders coming up the track. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her. 160 acres of caliche isn't worth a woman alone dying of heat and loneliness on it, he said. "I'm offering you a fair price. Take it, go back east, make a life." "This is my life," Rose said. "And it's been 3 years since you could legally use this land as open range anyway, Mr. Schofield. The Homestead Act was passed in '62. His jaw tightened at that. He did not like being quoted law at. Most men of his type did not. "Think carefully," he said. "I always think carefully," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Schofield." He left. The man with him gave her a long, flat look before they turned their horses, and she did not like the look, but she stood on the porch and watched them go and did not let the dislike show in her face. She told Cora about it when Cora came by 2 days later. Cora's expression went from concern to something harder. "He's been doing this all up and down the valley," Cora said. Amos heard from the Rionner brothers, you know the Rionner brothers, Northeast claim, that Schofield's men cut their fence line last month. Made it look like cattle broke through, but the cuts were too clean. "He can't legally take land that's been claimed under the Homestead Act," Rose said. "Legal and what a man like Schofield does aren't always the same thing," Cora said. Rose knew this was true. She also knew she was alone and that the nearest law was in Calico, which was 12 miles away and the town marshal, there was a man named Hubbard who was friends with Schofield and had been sheriff before the marshal consolidation 2 years ago. She wrote a letter to the land office in San Bernardino that week, documenting the visit and the offer and her refusal, and she kept a copy for herself in the tin box under the floorboard where she kept Thomas's letters and her claim certificate. September came and the heat broke, not completely but enough, and Rose breathed easier. On a Thursday morning in the second week of September, she was repairing a section of fence on the eastern boundary of her claim when she heard hoofbeats on the track. She straightened up with the fence pliers in her hand and squinted against the morning light. There were 2 horses. One was a bay with good lines, moving at an easy canter. The other was Cornelia, she realized with a start, who should have been in the corral. And then she saw that Cornelia was trotting alongside the bay of her own apparent free will, head up and ears forward in the mule version of animation, which meant that whoever was on the bay was someone Cornelia remembered and approved of, and Cornelia approved of almost no one. Rose's heart did something she had not given it permission to do. She did not move. She stood by the fence line with the pliers in her hand and watched Phineas Talbot ride toward her on a bay horse, wearing a clean shirt that was already acquiring road dust, his gray eyes finding her from 50 yards out and staying on her with the focused directness she remembered. He pulled up 10 feet away and dismounted in one easy movement. He was wearing a deputy's badge on his coat, which he had not been wearing before, and he looked different from the sun-hammered, half-dead man she had found in the desert, taller, somehow, or more solid, filled out with 3 months of regular eating, and without the sunstroke erasing him at the edges. Cornelia pushed past his horse and bumped Rose's shoulder with her nose, and Rose put her free hand on the mule's neck automatically, and she said, keeping her voice entirely level, "Mr. Talbot, Mrs. Hawthorne." He stood with his hat in his hands, turning the brim between his fingers in a way that she recognized as the gesture of a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was now uncertain about all of it. "I said I'd remember." "You did say that." "I've been trying to find my way back here since July," he said. "The Dillard case took me through Nevada, and I had a secondary matter in Tucson," and he stopped. He looked at her with the directness that seemed to be simply the way his face worked. "That sounds like excuses." "It sounds like a man with a job," she said. "I should have come sooner." The hat brim went through another revolution in his hands. "I owe you more than a pipe fitting, Rose." It was the first time he had used her given name. She was aware of it the way you are aware of the temperature change when you step from shadow into sunlight. "You don't owe me anything," she said, because it was true and she needed to say something. "I do," he said quietly. "I owe you my life, and I'm not a man who carries that lightly." He paused. "But that's not the only reason I came." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was very still, the desert at that early hour when the heat had not yet built, and everything was as clear and sharp as cut glass. A curve-billed thrasher was singing somewhere in the creosote. "How long can you stay?" she asked. Something released in his face when she said it, the held breath of a man who had ridden 400 miles on a hope and was now, finally, finding out whether the hope was warranted. "I have a month," he said, "before I need to be back in Prescott." "Then you'd better put your horse up," she said, "and I'll tell you what's been happening with Burl Schofield, because I think I might need a lawman." They walked back toward the homestead together, Cornelia trailing contentedly between the 2 horses, and the morning light was the color of new copper, and Rose Hawthorne thought, in the careful and private way of a woman who had loved once and lost it and was not sure she could survive losing it again, "Careful, be careful." But her heart was not being particularly careful. Her heart was, in fact, doing exactly as it pleased. He stayed. The first week was practical. She told him about Schofield, and he listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee going cold, asking precise questions about dates and incidents and the names of Schofield's men. He rode out the second day to look at the fence line on the eastern boundary and came back with a particular expression she was learning to read, one that meant he had seen something he did not like but was deciding how to address it. "Your east fence has been cut and rewired in 3 places," he said at supper. "Someone's been pushing it in, half a foot here, a foot there. Over time, that adds up to significant acreage." Rose set down her fork. "Schofield. Most likely. It's a common tactic, move the line gradually, hope the homesteader doesn't notice or can't prove it." He looked at her. "Have you had a survey done?" "Thomas did the original staking. I have his notes." "Thomas's notes may not hold up legally against a challenge. You need an official survey from a registered land surveyor." He paused. "I know a surveyor in San Bernardino who does good work. Honest man. If you'll authorize me to write to him, he could be out here within 2 weeks." "On what authority are you doing all this?" she asked, not unkindly, genuinely curious. He met her eyes. "On the authority of a man who owes you a debt and happens to have a badge," he said. "Also, land fraud is a federal matter when it involves homestead claims, so technically I'm not overstepping." She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Write to your surveyor," she said. The days fell into a rhythm that surprised her with how natural it felt. She rose early as she always did, and he was already up, having the fire going or water drawn or some task underway that needed doing. He was the kind of man who filled his hands when he was thinking, which meant the homestead gradually began to look less like a grieving woman's solitary effort and more like a working, going concern. He rehung the barn door that he had mended the hinge on 3 months before, properly this time, level and true. He patched the roof where 2 shingles had been letting in light. He helped her harvest and dry the remains of the kitchen garden before the first cold night came. In the evenings they talked. That was perhaps the thing that undid her, more than anything else, the talking. She had not had anyone to talk to in the deep evening hours since Thomas died, not genuinely talked to, and she had not realized how hungry she was for it, until Phineas was sitting across the table from her, and they were somewhere deep in a conversation about the territorial politics of water rights, or the particular loneliness of law work, or the question of what a person owed to a piece of ground they had chosen, and she would look up, and 2 hours had passed. He had a mind she respected. That mattered to her more than she could easily say. He was well read for a man of his background. He had been educated in a schoolhouse in rural Missouri before his family headed west, he said, and he had always read whenever he could get books, and he could argue a point with real precision, but he also knew when to stop arguing and listen, which was rarer. She told him things she had not told anyone. About Thomas's last days, the specific horror and helplessness of watching someone you loved die of something invisible. About Ohio, her father's schoolhouse, the smell of chalk and lamp oil on cold mornings. About the fear that drove her every day on this land, not fear of Schofield or of the desert or of loneliness, but the specific fear that she would give everything she had to this place and it would still not be enough. He listened to all of it. When she was done, he did not say it would be all right in the way that people said it when they had no idea whether it would be all right. He said, "Then we make sure it's enough." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was burning low and his face was all warm shadow and the gray eyes that she was, by now, entirely helpless against. "We," she said. He did not look away. "If you'll let me," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment and felt the careful, protective part of herself arguing with the part that had been alone for too long, and that recognized something real when it was sitting 3 feet away. Then she said, quietly, "I haven't decided that yet." "That's fair," he said. But when she went to bed that night, she lay awake for a long time listening to the desert night sounds, the coyotes far off, the wind in the creosote, the faint shuffle of Cornelia in the corral, and she thought about what it would mean to let someone in again. Not just practically in, not just to fix fences and write letters to surveyors, but genuinely in, the way Thomas had been in into the center of things, the place where it hurt the most when it went wrong. She thought about gray eyes that looked at her like she was worth looking at. She thought about a man who had been dying in the desert and had taken her water with those eyes open and aware, knowing what it cost her, and had never tried to make it smaller than it was. She fell asleep still thinking about it. The surveyor, a lean man named Calloway, arrived 8 days after Phineas wrote the letter. He was businesslike and thorough, and spent 2 full days walking the boundaries of Rose's claim with his instruments, and at the end of it, he sat at her kitchen table and showed her his findings. Schofield's men had moved her eastern fence line by nearly 40 feet over the course of what Calloway estimated was 3 or 4 separate incidents. The survey showed clearly where the original stakes had been still visible if you knew what to look for. Thomas's carefully notched cottonwood posts just barely showing above the scrub, and where the current fence line ran. 40 feet times 160 acres of depth, Calloway said. That's not a small piece of ground. No, Phineas said. He looked at Calloway. I need 2 copies of this survey filed with your registration numbers on both. One goes to Mrs. Hawthorne, one goes to the land office in San Bernardino. And one to you, Rose said. He looked at her. One to me, he agreed. Calloway filed the survey. Phineas rode to Calico and sent a telegram to the federal land office in San Bernardino directly, bypassing Marshal Hubbard entirely, which was the correct instinct. The response came back within a week. The matter was being forwarded to the district land commissioner, and Schofield would receive formal notice. On the same afternoon that Phineas rode back from Calico with that news, Schofield himself appeared at the homestead. He came alone this time, which was either a sign of confidence or of wanting to have a private conversation, and Rose was not sure which was more concerning until she saw Phineas step out of the barn behind her as Schofield dismounted, and she watched the cattle rancher's florid face go through several rapid calculations. Mr. Schofield, Phineas said, in the mild, unhurried voice of a man with a badge who has nothing to prove. Deputy Marshal Phineas Talbot, out of Prescott. I've been helping Mrs. Hawthorne with some land boundary questions. Might be you've already heard from the land commissioner's office. Schofield's jaw worked. He looked at Rose and then back at Phineas with the particular frustration of a man who has been outmaneuvered and knows it and cannot do anything about it in the present moment. I have legitimate grazing interests in this area, Schofield said. On your own land, absolutely, Phineas said pleasantly. Not on Mrs. Hawthorne's land. The survey's been filed and registered, Mr. Schofield, and copies are with the Federal Land Office. The fence line will need to be moved back to the correct boundary, which I'm sure your men can handle inside a week. You can't prove those fence moves were deliberate, Schofield said. I can prove where the original stakes are, Phineas said. The how and why of the current fence line is a matter I'll leave to the land commissioner, but the boundary is documented now, and any future discrepancy will be a great deal harder to explain. He let that sit for a moment. Good afternoon, Mr. Schofield. Schofield looked at Rose one more time. It was not a friendly look. But there was also no violence in it. Only the resentment of a man who has lost a particular hand and is calculating whether to play another, and she met his eyes steadily until he looked away first. He remounted and rode north without another word. Rose let out a breath she had been holding so long it had forgotten what it felt like to be let out. She turned to look at Phineas, who was leaning against the barn door post with his arms folded, watching Schofield's dust diminish. That's not entirely done, he said. He'll push back through the commissioner process, but it's documented now, and that's what matters. Thank you, Rose said. He looked at her. You don't have to thank me for that. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to, she paused. You're very good at being a marshal, Mr. Talbot. He looked slightly startled, as though compliments of that particular kind, clean and direct, from her were not something he had armored himself against. Phineas, he said, please. Phineas, she said, and smiled at him and watched him take that in. The following week was the one that changed things. It changed things in the small ways that large changes always begin in. The moment on Tuesday when she was reaching past him for a pan on the high shelf, and he steadied her elbow, and his hand lingered half a second longer than necessary, and neither of them mentioned it. The moment on Thursday when they rode out together to check the fence line and her horse shied at something in the scrub, and he was beside her before she had finished riding herself, his horse shoulder to shoulder with hers, his hand on her reins. The evenings that got longer and slower, the talking that went deeper. It changed, definitively, on Friday evening. She had been making biscuits and had flour on her hands and some of it on her face, she discovered later, and she had turned from the work table to say something about supper, and he was standing very close, closer than she had realized, and there was a look on his face that she recognized from a place she had not accessed in a long time, a look of a man trying very hard to be a gentleman about something. She said his name, just his name, Phineas. And he said, very quietly, "I know you said you hadn't decided yet, and I'm not going to ask you to decide anything tonight, but I need you to know." He stopped. He seemed to be looking for words that were accurate rather than merely sufficient. "I came back here because I owe you a debt, yes, but I've been here 3 weeks now and it has nothing to do with debt anymore, hasn't for some time." Rose looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm lamplight of her kitchen, and she thought about carefulness and about loss, and about the particular kind of loneliness that was worse than ordinary loneliness, because it was the loneliness of someone who knew what it felt like to not be lonely. And then she set down her floury hands and crossed the 2 feet between them and kissed him. He went very still for one heartbeat, as though making sure he had not misunderstood. Then his arms came around her, carefully at first and then not carefully at all, and she felt the solidness of him, the realness of him, and the careful part of her that had been arguing about all of this since September simply stood down. They stood that way for a long time, and the biscuits burned a little at the edges, and neither of them was remotely sorry about it. After that, things were different in the way that things are different when you have stopped pretending you do not feel what you feel. They were not reckless about it. Rose was not a reckless woman, and Phineas was not a reckless man, and they were both old enough and experienced enough with loss to know that some things deserved to be built carefully. But there was a different quality to the evenings now, to the mornings, to the simple fact of sharing the days. She found herself watching him when he did not know she was watching, which was not something she had done since the early days with Thomas, and she recognized the feeling for what it was. She was in love with him. She had not meant to be, had not organized herself toward it, but there it was, solid and clear as that well water, and just as necessary. He told her things in the evening hours that she understood were things he did not tell most people. About growing up the eldest of 4 children on a Missouri homestead that failed 2 years before they could get the patent. About his father, who had been a hard man but not an unkind one, and who had died in the war, the wrong side of the war, he said, looking at the table when he said it, and Rose, who had grown up in Ohio with a father who believed firmly in the Union, looked at him and said, "A man's father is not his choices, and you were a boy." He had looked at her when she said that with something she could only describe as a weight being put down. He had fought on the Union side himself at the end. He told her lied about his age and enlisted at 16, spent 8 months as a cavalry private before the war ended. He did not talk about what he had seen in those 8 months, but she understood from the way he didn't talk about it what kind of territory it was. He told her about the years on the ranch in New Mexico, about learning the land the way you only learn it by working it dawn to dark. About the marshal appointment, which had come through a territorial judge he had helped out of a difficult situation involving stolen cattle and a crooked freight company, and about the work, which he was honest about, the long solitary rides, the particular combination of boredom and sudden violence that law work consisted of, the difficulty of caring about places you never stayed long enough to belong to. "Do you want to belong somewhere?" she asked. He looked at her in the particular way that said she had asked the question that was at the center of everything. "I've been asking myself that for 10 years, he said. "I think I stopped asking sometime in the last 3 weeks." She held his gaze. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I'm a significant man," he said, with the smallest edge of humor, and she laughed, a real laugh, full and sudden, the kind she had not heard from herself in months, and he looked at her laughing like it was something he wanted to keep. In October, the land commissioner's representative arrived from San Bernardino. He was a young man named Foster, neat and slightly nervous in the way of government officials far from their desk, and he walked the eastern boundary with Callaway's survey in one hand and a federal ordnance document in the other. He confirmed that the fence line had been unlawfully moved and issued Schofield a formal correction order with a 60-day deadline to restore the original boundary, with a federal fine attached for the encroachment. Rose stood at her eastern fence and watched Foster write out the official document and felt something settle in her chest that had been waiting to settle for a long time. Schofield had 2 weeks left on his month's leave. He spent some of that time riding with her, not to look at fence lines, just riding, the way people ride when they want to be side by side in the open air without a task to justify it. The Mojave in October was transformed from its summer self. Cooler, cleaner, the light amber and horizontal, the creosote releasing a smell after the first rains that was like something fundamental and right. They rode out to the old Morrison site one afternoon, partly because she wanted to show him where it had all started, and they stood on the same stretch of trail where she had found him dying and looked at the scrub and the sky and the mountains, and he stood very close to her and said, "You changed the whole direction of my life in this spot." "I gave you some water," she said. "You gave me everything that came after," he said. She looked at him. The October light was in his gray eyes and on the old scar at his cheekbone. She reached up and touched it, that scar, something she had been wanting to do since July without acknowledging she had been wanting to, and felt him go still under her hand. "What was this?" she asked. "A man in Tucson, 3 years ago, who had a broken bottle and an objection to being arrested." He turned his face slightly into her hand like something involuntary. "I won the argument." "You won more than the argument," she said softly. He turned fully toward her then, and his arms came around her, and she pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness, and thought, "I was so afraid of this. I was so afraid of letting anyone be this close again, and here it is, and it is not dangerous at all. It is the safest place I have been in a year." The night before he was due to leave, they sat on the porch in the cooling dark, the stars extraordinary above the desert in the way that they were only when you were far enough from any town to see them properly. She was in the rocking chair and he was sitting on the porch steps with his back against the post, and she had her feet up on the low rail and a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. "I have to go back to Prescott," he said. "I know. I have obligations there, a case I need to close out, a commitment to the judge who gave me the appointment." He paused. "I can't just walk away from that." "I wouldn't respect you if you could," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't want to leave." "I know that too. I want to come back," he said. "Not for a month. I want to come back and stay. If that's—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly without worrying about what you think I want to hear." She looked down at him. His face in the starlight was very serious. "I always answer honestly," she said. "Is this a place you want someone to stay? Or is this your place, yours alone, the thing you built or are building, and I'm a good visit that you'd rather leave as that?" The directness of it hit her square in the chest, the way his directness always did. She thought about it for a real moment, honoring the seriousness of the question, and then she said, "I built this place hoping to share it. I've been sharing it with grief for a year. I would rather share it with you." She heard him exhale. Then he turned on the step and looked at her fully, and his expression was the one she had been cataloging without meaning to for a month, the one that was not composed at all, that was simply him, open and wanting and real. "Then I'll come back," he said. 3 months, maybe less. I'll close out Prescott and come back." "You said 3 months last time," she reminded him gently. "Last time I didn't have something specific to come back to," he said. "This time I do." She reached down from the chair and he reached up from the step, and their hands met in the dark between them. 3 months, she said. He left in the morning with the bay horse and a saddlebag of food she had packed, and the survey documents in a leather case, and a letter she had written to Calloway the surveyor thanking him for his thoroughness. He also left with her looking at him from the porch the way she had looked at him 3 months before from the fence line, and this time the leaving felt entirely different, not final, not the closing of something, but the pause between sentences, the breath between words. She watched him until he was gone. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the table and thought about the things that would need doing over the winter. The fence needed several sections repaired before the cold. The root cellar wanted new shelving. She should write to the land office about the patent progress, which at 2.5 years in was getting closer to the 5-year mark. She also thought, with a warmth she did not try to suppress, about a man with gray eyes and a level voice riding south toward Prescott, carrying her letter and her honest words and the knowledge that she was waiting. The winter was long but not lonely. Cora Birch came by regularly and brought gossip and food, and the kind of sturdy female company that Rose found herself leaning into gratefully. The Schofield situation resolved, as Phineas had predicted, through the official process. Schofield's men restored the fence line to the correct boundary in November, grumbling about it to anyone who would listen but complying because the federal order left him no choice. The line was straight and true, matching Calloway's survey exactly, and the day Rose walked it with her hand trailing along the restored wire, she felt the satisfaction of a thing properly settled. Letters arrived from Prescott every 2 weeks or so, reliably. Phineas wrote the way he talked, plainly, precisely, without ornament, and all the more effective for it. He told her about the Dillard case, which had finally broken open when Cord Dillard's partner turned state's evidence and identified 3 additional men, and about the subsequent round of arrests that had taken him briefly back into Nevada territory. He told her about Prescott itself, a growing town with ambitions it was not quite equipped for, and about the judge he worked under, a man named Whitmore who was fair but exacting and who had, when Phineas told him he intended to resign his appointment, expressed his displeasure at considerable length. He had submitted his resignation in November, the letter said. He would complete 2 final obligations, a court appearance in January and 1 last prisoner transfer in February, and then he would come to California. She read that letter twice and then wrote back the same evening. She told him about the fence, and the root cellar shelving, and Cornelia, who had developed an inexplicable fondness for the Birch's dog, and had taken to leaning over the fence to look south whenever Amos brought the dog by on visits. She told him, in the plainness that he had taught her was the best language between people who were serious about each other, that she was glad he was coming, and that the land would look different in February than it had in October, which she was looking forward to showing him. She told him at the end of the letter that she loved him. She had been planning to tell him in person, but the letter felt right, the weight of the written word in ink, permanent and deliberate, the way you said a true thing when you wanted it to stay said. His response came back in 10 days. He said he had read her letter 5 times before he was able to sit still enough to respond. He said he had known from the moment he saw her walking toward him across the desert scrub with a canteen in her hand, and no fear in her face, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever seen, and that everything that had followed had confirmed it. He said that he loved her, and here the handwriting changed slightly, as though he had stopped and started twice before simply committing to it, and that he would be in Calico by the 15th of February and at her door the 16th, and nothing short of an act of God would stop him. She kept the letter in the tin box with Thomas's letters and her claim certificate. She felt no conflict about that. Thomas would have approved of a man who fixed well casings and stood down Burl Schofield and wrote honest letters and came back when he said he would come back. She was as sure of that as she was of anything. February arrived in the Mojave with the particular cold clarity of a desert winter, the days sharp and bright and the nights genuinely cold, frost on the creosote each morning and ice on the water bucket that she had to break each dawn. She did not mind it. She found herself more present in these winter days than she had been since Thomas died, more aware of the light, and the land and the specific quality of this place that she had chosen and that had, through everything, held. On the evening of the 15th, she built a bigger fire than strictly necessary and cooked a proper supper and set the table for two, and then felt foolish about that and tried to talk herself into calm, and failed completely at calm, and sat on the porch in her coat watching the track north until the light failed. He was not there that night. She went to bed and slept badly and told herself there were 1,000 ordinary explanations: stage delay, road conditions, the bay horse going lame, and woke before dawn and made coffee, and sat with it at the table trying to feel reasonable. At mid-morning she heard hoofbeats. She walked to the door and opened it, and he was riding up the track on the bay horse, and he looked road-worn and tired and like he had been riding since before dawn, and he had a second horse behind him, a small gray mare, pretty-headed, which she did not yet understand the significance of. He dismounted, and she came down the porch steps, and they met in the yard, and he took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment with a relief so evident it almost undid her, and then he kissed her with a thoroughness that she felt from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. When he finally pulled back, she said, "You're a day late." "The stage from Prescott to Barstow was delayed by a washed-out bridge," he said. "I ended up riding the last 100 miles on the bay." He looked like it. "I left before dawn yesterday and rode through." "You rode 100 miles in a day and a half," she said. "You said you'd be waiting," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment and then turned to look at the gray mare. "Who is that?" "Her name is Lily," he said. "She's 5 years old and very well-mannered, and she used to belong to the wife of the judge in Prescott, who has since decided she prefers a buggy." I thought he paused, and for the first time in all her experience of him she saw something that might have been nervousness. "You might need a better horse than Cornelia for the days you need to cover distance, and Cornelia is, with the greatest respect, somewhat temperamental." Rose looked at the mare and then back at him. "You bought me a horse," she said. "As a start," he said quietly. "If you'll let me make a start." She looked at him in the February morning with the frost still in the shadows and the desert light clean and cold, and everything exactly as it was, her land, her homestead, his gray eyes, the mare that was the color of early morning, and she said, "Phineas Talbot, I offered you my last canteen in the desert, and you came back and fixed my well and stood down Burl Schofield and resigned your appointment and rode 100 miles without stopping." "Yes," he said, waiting. "I believe I'll let you make a start," she said. He smiled at her then, that smile that changed his whole face, the one she had been holding in her memory for months. He reached for her hand and held it, and they stood in the yard with the 2 horses and the mule and the cold, clear morning all around them, and Rose Hawthorne thought, "This is what after looks like. This is what it looks like when things begin again." The spring of 1875 was the finest spring the desert had given Rose since she had come to it, which she suspected had more to do with the company than with the weather, though the weather was also legitimately good. Enough rain in March to set the creosote blooming and coax color out of the dry washes, the temperature climbing slowly without the brutal suddenness of summer, the mountains on 3 sides green in their higher reaches. She and Phineas married in May. It was not a grand affair, but it was not small in the ways that mattered. Amos and Cora Birch stood with them at the little church in Calico, which was a Methodist affair that smelled of pine boards and candle wax, and the minister was a round-faced man named Denton who had performed probably 40 such ceremonies, and managed to make this one feel entirely specific to them, which Rose had not expected and was grateful for. She wore a blue dress that Cora had helped her alter from a pattern bought at the Mercantile, and she carried 2 sprigs of desert willow from the creek bed that Phineas had collected that morning without being asked, because he had noticed she stopped by the willows every time she passed them. He wore a dark coat that was clean and well-fitted, and his badge was in his pocket, not on his lapel, because he was not a marshal anymore, just a man who had come home. When Denton asked him if he took Rose Hawthorne to be his wife, Phineas looked at her and said, "I do," in the quiet, particular voice of a man who knows exactly what he is saying and means every word of it, and Rose felt it in her chest like something finally complete. She had a brief, private moment of thinking of Thomas, and she let herself feel it, the old love and the old loss. And then she let it rest where it lived, in the part of her that would always be shaped by it. And she looked at her new husband and said her own, "I do," with a fullness that she had not been sure, 1 year ago, she would ever feel again. They had a wedding supper at the Birches' place, Cora having taken over the kitchen with the comprehensive authority of a woman who regarded all occasions of celebration as her personal responsibility. There were other neighbors there as well, the Reener brothers who had had their own troubles with Schofield, and the Hendersons from the claim to the north, and a couple of miners from the Calico district who had known Thomas and came to pay their respects to his widow's new beginning. It was a gathering that felt, in the way of such things in hard country, like a declaration. This woman is not alone, and this land is not abandoned, and things can begin again. They rode home to the homestead in the late evening, just the two of them on Lily and the bay, the desert cooling around them and the first stars appearing above the mountains, and Rose looked at her land from the saddle and felt the specific peace of a person who has decided something and found the decision was right. "What are you thinking?" Phineas asked. He had a way of asking it that was not intrusive, just present, genuinely asking. "I'm thinking about 3 years from now," she said. "When the patent comes through," he looked at her. "What about it?" "We'll have built it ourselves," she said, "every year of it. The 5 years they require, except the first 2 will have been just me, and then the last 3 will be ours." She paused. "That seems right." He reached across the space between the horses and she met him halfway, their hands linking in the dark. "It seems exactly right," he said. They lived that year well. Phineas, with his ranching background, transformed the practical running of the homestead in ways that were substantial. He knew about soil and water management and the particular art of running livestock in arid country, and he brought knowledge to the land that complemented what Rose had built and what Thomas had started. They acquired 3 goats for milk and cheese and the incidental comedy of their personalities, and a small flock of chickens that Cornelia regarded with permanent suspicion. Phineas also applied for a position as deputy with the Calico Sheriff's Department, which was a real position now, separate from the federal marshals, staffed by the county, and was accepted readily. The work was less dramatic than federal marshaling but more consistent. Cattle disputes, claim-jumping complaints, the occasional saloon disturbance. He came home each evening to the homestead, which he had never done in the Prescott years, and Rose watched him adapt to the shape of a rooted life, with the adjustment of someone who had not known how much he wanted it until he had it. Schofield remained a presence on the edges of their lives, but a quieter one. The federal fine had diminished his enthusiasm for fence-line games, and Phineas's presence as a county deputy made the legal landscape of any future maneuvering considerably less attractive. By the summer of 1875, Schofield had redirected his attention north, buying up range land in a different county, and while Rose did not trust the quietness, she was grateful for it. In August, Cora Birch came by with a knowing look and a package of ginger tea and said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the authority of a woman who knows things before they are announced, "When were you going to tell me?" Rose looked at her. "Tell you what?" Cora looked at her steadily. Rose looked down at her coffee cup. Then she looked back up at Cora with a smile she had been keeping private for 2 weeks. "I wasn't sure yet," she said. "You're sure now," Cora said. "I'm nearly sure," Rose said. "A few more weeks to be certain." Cora reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying, only the warmth of good news between women who had been neighbors through hard years and were now sharing a happy one. Rose told Phineas that evening. She had been deciding how had run through several approaches during the day and ended up simply telling him while they were washing up after supper, her back to the work table and him turning from the dish rack, and she just said it. "I think we're going to have a baby." The look on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the polished, composed expression of a man in control of his reactions. It was the completely undone face of a man who has been given something that he had not let himself hope for, because hoping for it was too much to survive if it did not come. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her carefully, the way he held things he was afraid of breaking, and she put her arms around him and felt him shaking slightly, and she thought, "This is a man who has never had a home, and now he has one and a child coming, and he does not know how to carry it all at once." "You're all right?" he asked, his voice against her hair. "I'm better than all right," she said. He pulled back to look at her face, checking, the way he always did, not doubting her but wanting to see for himself. She held his gaze and let him see what was there. Certainty, happiness, the particular piece of a woman who has built something real and is watching it grow. He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then, more slowly, her mouth. He tasted like coffee and home. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. The baby came in March of 1876, on a raw and windswept morning when the desert was doing something between winter and spring, and could not seem to decide which. Cora was there, because Cora was indispensable in all matters that required competence and command, and the doctor from Calico came and was actually useful this time, arriving with enough time to be present and helpful, which Rose appreciated, and which she thought, with some private humor, was an improvement over the last time a Calico doctor had been relevant to her life. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with a full-throated announcement of his displeasure at the transition and a head of dark hair that would probably lighten as he grew. And he was the most astonishing thing Rose had ever seen, which she thought, even accounting for the fact that all new mothers likely thought this. Phineas came in after, when Cora had settled Rose and the baby and tidied the room with her characteristic brisk efficiency, and he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression of such complete and helpless love that Rose felt her throat tighten. "Hello," he said to the baby, very quietly. The baby stopped crying for a moment and seemed, in the way of new babies, to pay attention to the voice. Phineas looked up at Rose. "He's real," he said. "He's real," she agreed. "What do we call him?" She had thought about this. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Phineas Hawthorne Talbot, if that's all right." Phineas looked at her, and she saw him understand what she was doing, not erasing the past but carrying it forward, making a name that held everything and left nothing out. "That's more than all right," he said. His voice was rough. He cleared his throat. "That's perfect." Young Thomas, as the household quickly took to calling him to distinguish him from the memory he was named for, turned out to be a child of considerable personality and no particular tolerance for quiet. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's copper-red hair and opinions on everything from the temperature of his breakfast porridge to the behavior of the Birch's dog, which he regarded with a combination of fascination and suspicion that was extremely reminiscent of Cornelia. The homestead patent came through in the spring of 1877. It came as a document from the General Land Office in Washington, signed and sealed, stating that Rose Hawthorne Talbot had met all requirements under the Homestead Act of 1862 and was the duly recognized owner of the 160 acres described therein. It was a piece of paper, technically. It was also 5 years of work and grief and determination. The well and the fence and the kitchen garden and the cold winters and the brutal summers and a dying man in the desert and everything that had followed from the moment she had decided to give her last water to a stranger. She read it at the kitchen table with Thomas on her hip and Phineas standing behind her, and when she finished reading, she set it down on the table and put her free hand over her face and let out a single, shaking breath that had somewhere inside it every hard thing of the past 5 years. Phineas's hand came to her shoulder. He did not say anything for a moment, just held her there, and she felt him, steady and present as he always was. "It's yours," he said. "Ours," she said from behind her hand. "Ours," he agreed, and she heard what it meant to him. A man who had grown up on a homestead that failed and had been moving ever since. A man who had spent 15 years living out of a saddlebag and calling places by their direction from other places. A man who had ridden 400 miles in October and 100 miles in February and crossed a desert on a borrowed mule and come back because one woman had given him water and he owed her more than water. She lowered her hand and looked at the document. Then she looked at her son, who was looking at the document with the serious, slightly frowning attention of a 1-year-old encountering paper, and she laughed. "Don't eat that," she told him. Thomas Phineas Hawthorne Talbot redirected his attention to her collar instead, which was acceptable. Phineas came around to sit across from her at the table, as he had sat across from her 100 times, and he looked at her in the way that she was long since finished being surprised by but never tired of, the way that said she was the most interesting person in the room, which she knew was not objectively true, but which she had learned to simply accept as the particular flavor of his love for her. "I want to add to the claim," he said. She looked at him. "Add to it. There's 80 acres adjacent to the east, the old Morrison site, in fact, most of it. Since Bart Morrison never filed a patent and it's been abandoned 3 years, it reverts to open filing status. He had clearly been thinking about this for a while. With what I've saved from the deputy's position over the past 2 years and what we'd get from selling the goats, not Cornelia, she'd never forgive us. We could file on that parcel. Give Thomas room when he's old enough to want it." Rose looked at him. She looked at the patent document on the table. She looked at her son, who had moved on from her collar to an exploration of the buttons on her dress. She looked at the kitchen, the stove, the window with the morning light coming through it, the desert visible beyond the glass, clear and vast, and theirs. "The Morrison site," she said. "Where I found you." "Where you found me," he said. "It's fitting," she said. "It seemed fitting to me," he said. She reached across the table and he met her halfway, which was the kind of arithmetic she had come to believe in, the kind where 2 people each take the same distance and the gap closes between them. "File on it," she said. "File on it and let's build something." They filed on the Morrison parcel that April. The summer of 1877 was a working summer, the same as all the summers before it, but with a different quality. Not the desperate urgency of a woman alone trying to hold something together, but the engaged and willing labor of 2 people making something larger than either of them could make alone. They extended the fence line. Phineas sank a second well on the Morrison ground that struck clean water at 30 feet. They planted a row of cottonwood saplings along the creek line that would take years to grow tall enough to matter, but that they planted anyway, because that was what it meant to intend to stay. Cora Birch sat on the porch with Rose one September evening watching Thomas, who was 18 months old and staggering around the yard with the purposeful incompetence of a person who has recently discovered locomotion, and Phineas working the fence line in the distance against the orange sky. "You're happy," Cora said. It was not a question. "I'm happy," Rose said. "You've been happy for a while," Cora said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who feels she has contributed to the result. "I have," Rose said. "I was afraid of it for a long time. After Thomas, the first Thomas. I was afraid that being happy again meant something about him, meant I was forgetting or replacing or—" "And now?" Cora asked. Rose watched her husband work the fence line with the last of the daylight. She watched her son fall down and get up and fall down again and laugh at himself. She felt the evening air coming in cool off the mountains, which it did at this time of year, and she thought about what she knew now that she had not known a year ago or 2 years ago. "Now I think love is not a fixed amount," she said. "That you don't use it up. That there's always more if you're willing to let there be." Cora made a sound of warm agreement and reached over and patted her knee. Thomas walked unsteadily up to the porch steps and grabbed the post for balance, and looked at his mother with Phineas's gray eyes and an expression of profound satisfaction at having successfully crossed the yard. Rose reached down and scooped him up and held him against her shoulder, and he grabbed a fistful of her hair with the casual possessiveness of small children, and she laughed. Phineas came in from the fence line at last light, pulling off his work gloves and shaking dust from his hat, and came up the porch steps and kissed Rose and took Thomas from her arms and held his son up to look at the first stars appearing, telling him their names the way he did every clear evening, the way his own father had done for him before things went wrong in Missouri. Thomas reached for the stars in the way all children did, fingers spread wide, and Phineas said softly, "Not yet. But you'll get there." Rose watched them, her husband and her son, against the darkening desert sky, and she thought about the day she had walked toward a dying man in the scrub and made the only decision that could have led to all of this. She thought about how close she had come to choosing differently, how easy it would have been to keep her water and keep her careful distance and keep moving. She was glad she had not kept moving. She was glad she had stopped and crouched beside a stranger in the dust and said, "Hey, wake up," and had given him everything she had left to give. He had said he owed her more than water. He had been right about that. But what she had received in return was not a debt paid off. It was not a transaction at all, not an exchange of equal things. What she had received was something that had no proper accounting. A man who came back when he said he would come back, who fixed what was broken and stood against what was wrong and rode 100 miles without stopping because she said she would be waiting, who sat at her table in the evening and talked about the things that mattered and listened to the things she needed to say, who held their son up to the stars and told him their names. In the winter of 1877, Rose found she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easier than the first. She was more settled in her body and her days, less anxious, more able to rest without guilt. She told Phineas on the porch one cold evening with the fire inside warm behind them through the window, and he pulled her close and held her for a long time without speaking, and she felt his gratitude in the quality of his silence. "Another one," he said at last. "Another one," she confirmed. "Thomas won't know what to do with a sibling," he said with affection. "Thomas can barely walk reliably," she said. "He has time to adjust." Phineas laughed against her hair. She felt the laugh in his chest, the rumble of it, the realness of him, solid and warm against the cold night. She thought, as she sometimes did, about the specific chain of chance that had brought them here, the well-going brackish, the Morrison pipe fitting, the distance miscalculated, one canteen, the fall of the sun at just the angle that had made her see him from 50 yards rather than riding past. She thought, some things you cannot plan. Some things you can only do and let what follows follow. The second baby came in June of 1878, when the desert was at its most dramatic and beautiful in the early mornings before the heat, when the light was so clear it seemed to have weight. It was a girl this time, dark-haired, and, from the first moments, serene in a way that young Thomas had never been, studying her parents with wide, dark eyes as though she had arrived with more information than expected. They named her Clara June Talbot, for the month and for nothing more complicated than the name suiting her exactly, and Rose held her in the afternoon light of their bedroom while Phineas sat beside her on the bed, and Thomas, 2 years old now, climbed up to investigate the arrival with proprietary suspicion, and she looked at all three of them and thought, "Here it is. Here is what I was building toward. This is the thing the land was for. The land was for this." The homestead grew in the years that followed. The cottonwood saplings grew too, slowly at first, and then with the sudden commitment of trees that have finally decided on their surroundings. The Morrison parcel integrated into their lives as naturally as though it had always been theirs. Amos Birch died in 1879, quietly and without apparent suffering, and Cora grieved for a long while and then came more frequently to Rose's table, and their friendship deepened into the particular richness of women who have weathered significant things together. Phineas was promoted to county sheriff in 1880, an appointment he had not sought, and that surprised him when it was offered. He accepted it with the same deliberate seriousness with which he did everything, went home that evening and told Rose at supper, and she reached across the table and squeezed his hand and said, "You are always better suited to building something stable than chasing something fleeing." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "Like you," he said. "Like me," she agreed. By the time the patent on the Morrison parcel came through in 1882, they had 240 acres, clean water in 2 wells, a barn that was genuinely sound, a house that had been expanded twice to accommodate the family and the visiting, the cottonwood row along the creek that was now tall enough to provide real shade, and 4 goats because Phineas had filed on 3 more after swearing they would sell the first ones. Cornelia was still alive. This was accepted by everyone as a declaration of pure will. Thomas, at 6 years old, was his father's shadow at every reasonable hour, and could name every star the naked eye could see from the Calico Valley. Clara, at 4, had opinions that ran considerably ahead of her years, and a way of looking at a problem from the sides that made Rose think of her own father, the schoolteacher, and she had the joy of it. One October evening, October, always October, with its cool clarity and its amber light, Rose and Phineas rode out together the way they sometimes did when the children were with Cora, east along the old track toward the Morrison site, and they rode without talking for a while in the ease of people who do not need to fill the air between them. They stopped at the place. She knew it by the shape of the scrub, by the angle of the mountains behind it, by the way the light lay across the caliche at this hour. There was no marker and no reason there should be one. It was just a stretch of desert trail like 100 other stretches of desert trail, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone passing. Phineas pulled the bay to a stop and looked at it. The bay was older now, a little gray at the muzzle, steady as he had always been. Phineas looked like a man who had found his gravity and had been resting in it for years, broader in the shoulders, weathered in a good way, the scar at his cheekbone silver in the October light. 4 years ago this month, he said. Almost to the day, she said. He looked at her across the distance between the horses. He had a way of looking at her still after all this time, as though she was the most important thing in his sightline, as though the rest of the landscape was simply context. "You know what I think about," he said. "What I've thought about 100 times. Tell me," she said. "I think about you doing the arithmetic," he said. "Standing right here, 3 months after your husband died, exhausted and alone and a dozen miles from home, and looking at your last canteen and looking at a stranger who was going to die if you didn't do something about it, and running the numbers and knowing they didn't add up." He paused, and doing it anyway. She looked at the stretch of ground. She remembered the arithmetic. She remembered the weight of the canteen, the feel of the man's head in her hand, the cracked sound of his voice when he spoke. "I thought of Thomas," she said. "The first Thomas. I thought of him reaching for a cup that was empty." Phineas was quiet. "I didn't want to be the person who let a cup be empty when I had water in it," she said. "Even if the numbers didn't add up." She looked at him. "The numbers almost never add up in the moment. That's what I've learned." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the space between them, the horses cooperating, as the horses had learned to cooperate over years of this kind of closing distance, and he reached out and took her face in both hands the way he had the morning he came back in February, and he said quietly, "I owe you more than water. I always have and I always will." "You don't owe me anything," she said, for the second time in 4 years. "Then I'll give it freely," he said. "All of it, every single day of it." She covered his hands with hers. "That's more than I ever asked for," she said. "Good," he said. "It's what you're getting." She laughed, and he kissed her in the October light on the stretch of trail where everything had started, and the desert was quiet around them, and the mountains were turning to gold in the descending sun. And somewhere back along the road, their children were at Cora Birch's table eating the woman's incomparable cornbread, and arguing with each other about the names of stars. And the well was full of clean water, and the patent certificates were in the tin box under the floorboard alongside Thomas's letters. All of it together, the old love and the new love and the land that had held through everything. And Rose Hawthorne Talbot held onto her husband's hands in the fading light and felt down in the honest center of her that this was what it was, this was what it meant to have stayed. Not the patent or the acres or the things that could be measured, though those mattered and she was proud of them. But this, a person who looked at you like you were worth looking at and rode back when they said they would ride back and built alongside you and stayed. The sun finished its crossing behind the Calico Mountains and the first stars came out, and they turned their horses toward home together, and the desert night opened above them, vast and full of light, the same sky it had always been, under which everything that had happened and everything that was still to come was waiting, patient as the land itself. They rode home.